Thanks, Gil. Thanks, everybody, and congratulations to your department on 10 years. What an exciting day it is for you, and what an honor it is for me to be among these distinguished folks who have given this lecture. This will be well, first, Gil, thank you for everything you've done for the AAAS. I agree with you that the Science family are the most distinguished journals in the world, but I've seen a lot of instances of the word nature up here today. So I just want to make sure everybody knows where to find me. Because, you know, as Gil said, you should think of us first. We still might reject your paper, but you should still think of us first. No, listen, if you get to be the editor-in-chief of Science, it's just one of the truly extraordinary opportunities for a scientist, and I'm so fortunate to be able to do it. And I appreciate Gil and his intro mentioning the fact that there was turmoil at the University of North Carolina. I hate it when people say, oh, and then he was the chancellor, and then he was the provost, and like the students are going, oh, I guess everything went perfectly in his life. And that's not a very good educational message. Because even though I had this meteoric rise in my career, I got absolutely destroyed at the University of North Carolina when I was a chancellor, by a combination of politics and intercollegiate athletics and inexperience. And so it's just a reminder that when you hear these intros of people, a lot of times the hard parts get left out, and no one who gets a glowing introduction really has that story. So that's an important thing for students to hear. And I really enjoyed interacting with you all earlier today. So this will be the least technical talk you've heard because I don't do experiments anymore. I don't have a lab anymore. What I do is observe the behavior of scientists. And so my predecessor, Jeremy Berg, liked to refer to us as sociologists of science. And so that's what I'm going to tell you about today. And I have another great colleague who's our executive editor now and runs life sciences for us, Val DeVinson. She refers to what we do as being the people who work backstage. You all, when you publish with us, you're the people that are on the stage. We're the people that are making sure you have your props and that the lights work and that the orchestra sounds good. And as Gil said, I grew up in the theater, so that metaphor really, really works for me quite a lot. But what I want to do today is talk to you about all of these trends that we have in science related to the word open, and how it's much more complicated than it sounds, and the implications of it are profound. And those of you who are going to be leading us forward, you're the ones that are going to have to wrestle with all this stuff. And I'm going to pick three papers that bring these complications out in different ways and tell you from the point of view of the stage manager how this open thing is going to play out. And of course, there's a lot of good that's going to come out of it and already has, but there are a lot of complicated things to think about. So first, just the slides that I show at the beginning of every talk. And, you know, I usually talk to general audiences, so you probably know where to find us on the internet, and you probably know about our 6 journals. The impact factor of science is 63, which is either really impressive or something that you should ignore, depending on how you view impact factors and H indices and all these crazy things that we have. But I can tell you, we had the biggest jump ever this year, and the reason was because of COVID. So one thing you can watch after next year, I think, you know, we'll probably sustain it, but after next year, a whole bunch of these prestigious journals are going to have their impact factors go down when these COVID papers are no longer in our impact factors. And that has never happened before. So this will be a very entertaining sociological experiment for you all to observe, because everyone who's been bragging about their impact factor is suddenly not going to say anything about it because it's going to go down. But of course, it's nothing but just an artifact of what we went through with the pandemic. The science journals, the 5 subscription journals, are different from the journals that I grew up with in the American Chemical Society, in that the people who make all the decisions and handle all the papers for us, it's their full-time job to do that. And for those of you, we're talking about jobs today, it is a really wonderful line of work. There's a lot of vacancies, just like there are across the labor market. And so it's something for you to think about. You get to work from home, you get to go to conferences, you see all the great science in the world. We have a lot of people who get in that job and stay in it for 30 years because they really have a good time doing it. They're brilliant, brilliant people. Somebody who reads papers for a living is just as interesting to talk to as your faculty or graduate student colleagues at a great department like this. They're just unbelievably powerful scholars. Then we have one large open access journal, Science Advances, and we use academic editors there, like all the ACS journals do, and many of the journals that you're publishing in. The parent journal, Science, is 3 different things. It's a research journal in the back that I think I had this on the previous slide. Gets 12,000 submissions. We publish 750 of those. The other 11,250 people are mad at me. Yeah, if I ever write a memoir about my time in this job, it'll be entitled, "Sorry, we didn't have better news for you," which is something that I say to a lot of people every day. We're proud of what we publish, and we think it has a lot of impact. The other thing in science is the news department. We have 30 journalists that work for us. They all went to journalism school. They're very traditional journalists, like you see in TV shows about journalists. They go through people's trash and stake out their labs and file public records requests and write edgy stories about things that are going on in science. There's an opening for the director of the Salk Institute, which I think we're probably responsible for. We've exposed a lot of other great things, and there's a lot of careers content that we and all of our competitors are using that I hope you all find interesting, and our journalists all over the world. It's a huge amount of fun to work with these folks. They're editorially independent of me, which means I can't tell them what to cover. I can't tell them not to cover something, but if they screw up, it's my problem. And that's okay, because I really enjoy working with them. And then we have our commentary section, Insights. You see the 5 different types of content we have there. This is where scientists talk to each other. So unlike a lot of opinion outlets, our opinion outlet is an outlet for scientists to write opinions for other scientists. And when we think about science as a journal, a lot of people say, well, can you make something for K through 12, or can you make something so that I can convince my climate denying uncle that climate change is real? We don't do that stuff. Scientific American and the Discovery Channel and Weekly Reader, they all, Sesame Street, they do a great job of that stuff. Our magazine is for scientists. So it's for scientists to talk to other scientists. It's news that scientists want to read, and it's research that scientists want to read. We do impact the public in a few very important ways. The most important is when there's news coverage of our research papers. And we have a whole team dedicated to making sure that the papers get covered and that they're covered accurately. And this is a major issue in science, because when the mainstream media, and we saw this big time in the pandemic, when the mainstream media covers a paper and does it inaccurately, that's what the public reads. So if that's inaccurate, then that gives the public a way to say that we don't know what we're doing, even though our paper is accurate. The news story is inaccurate. That's what the public sees. And this is a major, major challenge. And it's really only Science and Nature that have teams that that work at making sure these things are accurate and go back and get things corrected if they're wrong. That's a very labor intensive thing. And so when people pay for science, the team that handles the earned media coverage is one of the big things that they're paying for. I know your librarian's not here, but that's a plug for them to keep their subscription up with us. Okay, so look, who doesn't like the word open, right? I mean, it sounds good. You know, let's have this open, that open, everything open. Nobody wants anything closed. People don't like paywalls. People think that all information should be free and democratized. And of course, that sounds good, and there's a lot of great things about it. But we've got, so, you know, here's the Merriam-Webster's open, having no enclosing or confining barrier, accessible on all or nearly all sides. All right, that sounds good, okay? But it's complicated to do. And I'm going to show you some examples where that's true, okay? The first is in what we refer to as open access, which is the idea that the version of record of a paper should be accessible to everyone, even if they don't have a subscription to the journal. The challenge with this is that all these things we do, the journalists, the people who do earned media, the people who work for us full time, managing a Twitter feed with 3 million people on it, you expect all these things to be done by us. We have to pay them for them somehow. And what happened in the early years of this open access idea is that the commercial publishers figured out, hey, this is great. We'll just charge the authors to pay us to publish their paper. And there's a whole bunch of, and you don't see Elsevier and Springer Nature and Wiley, who are the main commercial publishers, yelling and screaming about this open access thing because they love it. Because they don't like negotiating with the librarians for their subscriptions. They can't get very big price increases that way, but they know the authors are really wanting to publish their papers. So if they can charge you $11,000 to publish your paper in Nature and make it open access, and they can get the federal government to tell them you have to pay them that, then not only is, I mean, first of all, they're still getting their subscription fees, at least for the time being. So they're getting that from the librarians. Now they're getting $11,000 from you, and you're at the big old bad mojo factory, University of Michigan, which has enough money to pay the $11,000. But what if you were in ecology and all you had was one NSF grant? What if you were at an HBCU or in a low and middle income country and you couldn't pay $11,000? Well, then you can't publish in Nature. And that's not good for anyone. So this open access sounds good because it means everybody can read it. But it also means that if we're going to subsidize all of these functions, that's going to end up getting charged to grants. And that means only people with a lot of grants are going to be able to publish. And if you need papers to get grants and you don't have any papers yet, how are you going to get a grant if you can't afford to publish? All right. And so there's a lot of inequity baked into this. The other thing is that then the underlying papers are all being given to these commercial entities. So as Gil pointed out, the science journals are nonprofit. We do make a surplus, and we give that surplus to the American Association of the Advancement of Science to do all the important things that they do in science literacy, science diplomacy, all of these science policy, all of these important functions. The commercial publishers make a surplus that they return to their shareholders. And now, so you probably never even noticed this, but if you publish an open access paper, either with an open access journal or by paying an additional fee to a subscription journal, you get what's called a CC-BY license. Okay, now that CC-BY license not only means that the paper is available to lots of people and free, it means anyone can take that paper and change it and do something else with it. So somebody can take your paper, scratch out the part that they disagree with, and publish it again. with their own stuff on it, and they don't have to give you anything for it. That's what that CC BY license does. And most people don't even know this is happening. All right. And so you are, you know, I guess, so a lot of people say, well, I don't like signing that copyright form that gives the copyright of my paper to science or the publisher. But when you get that CC BY license, you're giving it to every publisher, and they can do anything they want to with it. So this open access thing is pretty complicated. It's creating a barrier to publishing in exchange for lowering the barrier to read. And that sounds good. A lot of people weren't paying attention to this. This whole thing got this way, and now we're getting ready to pay a big price for that. Okay, open data, right? So y'all are putting your data on Zenodo and your code on GitHub, all right? And most of the time, you can do that for free. But eventually, as we put more and more data up with every single paper, the cost of storing that and the cost of maintaining that is going to go up and up and up, and eventually, and it's already happening, there are a lot of commercial entities that are going to want you to pay them to host that. And not only are you paying them to host it, but you're giving it to them so that they can use those data, they can resell those data, and they can use them to come to their own scientific conclusions. And you know, you're creating these behemoths, and eventually, you know, if Elsevier does that, then they'll get good at it, and Amazon will buy it, and they'll merge it with One Medical, and you can imagine, you know, what's going to happen to all those data that you, with federal dollars, generated. If you have to deposit them, you're basically giving them to Amazon and Elsevier and whoever else for free. All right, open code, same issues there. Who pays? GitHub, you know, how do we decide that it's the actual code? Okay, the author says it's the code, but do we know that? Same thing with open data. We don't go trolling around the internet to make sure that authors didn't put up their code long enough to get the paper, or their data long enough to get the paper published and then take it down. We can't afford to do that. Who's going to do that? So these are all complicated questions related to all this, and I'll take you through three little sagas about that. First, on open access, I said all this stuff, but here's our policy, which is in this editorial. You notice I'm not an author on this. The way science works, we have a publisher. That's the person who does the business side. I'm responsible for the content. And then Sudip Parikh, who's the CEO of the AAAS, is the executive publisher. So something like our open access policy, that's their deal. I'm supposed to make the best content in the world. They're the ones, and Shirley Malcolm, somebody who works with us on lots of equity and social justice issues, and she's an American treasure for those of us who know her. But in this article, they lay out what our policy is, which is we're not taking money to make papers open access. We're allowing authors to take the accepted version of the manuscript, not the final one where we fixed all the illustrations and put all the links in and all that stuff and copy edit it, the version before that, and deposit it anywhere they want, and eventually it'll be on PMC. And you can say, wow, you're giving away a lot there. Well, we are. But the alternative is to charge for it and to charge direct costs into grants. And we don't think that's good for science. So we're hoping that the librarians will continue to buy our subscriptions and that we can do this as a way of satisfying the demand that people have for open access without double dipping like the commercial publishers are doing. And one thing about the paywalls, whenever you see somebody on social media complaining about a paywall on a paper, it's almost always somebody who works at a university that has a license. They're basically just saying they can't be inconvenienced to log on to their VPN to read the paper. And I'm sorry, you know, if I'm an author in a low income country and I'm going to be excluded from publishing because someone at the University of Michigan thinks it's too inconvenient to go on their VPN, you know, that doesn't hold together as far as I'm concerned. So, you know, I know it's a drag to log onto the VPN if you're at home, but tell your librarian to make the VPN better, you know? Okay, so, you know, I usually give these talks for very general audiences. I'm bringing the coals to Newcastle with this slide, but I know I think you're probably all familiar with the work in applying artificial intelligence to protein structure prediction. I know there are groups here that have done a great job with this. I'm going to talk mainly here about the Google group and David Baker's group. But you know, this is how I explain protein folding to a much more general audience than this. But there's an important thing here because the solution to this required two things that relate to open access, open code and open data. One is that the PDB had to have been built because we wouldn't have had this protein structure prediction without somebody having the vision to build the PDB whenever it was 30, 40 years ago. And the other is, what's that? Even longer? Yeah. And you know, it's no good if the code isn't available to everyone, because then, you know, it's just Google winning a contest. It's not actually taking protein structure to everybody who deserves a chance to use it. So, you know, again, this is how I explain things, but this is also a plug. This is the drug I developed. This is the crystal structure of it. So I always like to show this. But of course, this is the reason why this is one of the reasons why we need accurate structures so that we can do this without having to get a crystal. And, you know, I like to tell audiences that this all started with myoglobin. Brian was correctly saying lysozyme was also important, but lysozyme doesn't have a metal in it. So I like to show this one since I'm a bioinorganic chemist. But this is where things started. And here's here's the first 50 years of this. We went from Perutz and Kendrew winning the Nobel Prize for myoglobin at 6 angstroms in 1962, and then another Nobel Prize for cryo-EM in 2017, where we got to the point where we didn't have to crystallize the protein in order to get these structures. But then we get to the state of the art in 2012. I didn't plan this, but I guess 2012, CASP started the same year you started your department. Is that correct?
No, it started earlier, but that's when we started winning, right?
Yeah, okay, that's when you started winning, even better. Yeah. CASP started in 94?
Yeah.
Wow, okay. So this is some paper I found with a bunch of the CASP structures from 2012. You know, these are relatively small proteins, but everybody was still really excited about this. I was in an administrative fog at the time this happened, so I didn't learn about this until more recently. And like I said, this is from my predecessor, Jeremy Berg, who points out eloquently at the time that all of this kind of came to this conclusion that, you know, we wouldn't be where we are if it hadn't been for the visionaries who set up the PDB. And, you know, he goes through, this is the most important paragraph of all this, you know, that the cultural shifts were often, controversial, but it is hard to argue that, you know, the structures wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the PDB, and the structural prediction problem has been solved. It's hiding in the PDB, he says, you know, and I think that's absolutely right. And so on the good side of open is the PDB and the visionaries that set it up and figured out how to host all the data and made it so that we can download the viewer and look at all the structures. And, you know, people who came along later just take all that for granted, that it's straightforward to do. I'm kind of in the middle on that. You know, we certainly, in the 80s, we had plenty of protein structures, but you couldn't just get on a PC and play with them till much later than that. So all of this has come along during my time in science.
My last PDB looked like phone books, and we had mag tapes. And we wanted
there you go. Right.
There was no real way. There was no internet.
Yeah. So once the PDB came to the internet, it was pretty amazing. All right. So you all know this. DeepMind started winning CASP. And of course, they got a huge group at Google that they applied to this. Of course, I haven't this animated in the PowerPoint version of this talk, but I knew you were PC people, so I sent PDF for my slides. So, but you all seen these movies a million times before anyway. Google's winning CASP. They are obviously closing in on the answer to this. But initially their algorithm was not widely available. So they get, right after the latest CASP that they won. Of course, we know there's going to be a big paper on this. They've always been nature people on their protein stuff, but of course we had to make a run at trying to get the paper. So we talked to Demis and told him how great it was that he'd accomplished all this stuff, how it would look great on the cover of Science, and everything else we could think of to tell him. But and we made a decent pitch, but he decided to go to Nature. But in those conversations, it came up, well, what are you going to do with the code? If we publish this, will everybody be able to go somewhere and do their own predictions, or how's this going to work? Because up until that time, that code was not widely available. And we probably would have taken the paper if with some kind of agreement that we probably wouldn't have been thrilled about the access, because it was a big enough paper and we wanted it. But we were worried about that, and we were debating that. So he goes to Nature. We're licking our wounds and saying, oh well, we tried to get it. Then we get a phone call from David Baker, who says that this brilliant postdoc of his, Dr. Bike, has figured out how to do this a lot more inexpensively, and that they want to publish the paper with us, and they're going to make the code freely available. So we thought that was pretty awesome. We wanted to get the paper out before Nature did. We reviewed it got it reviewed very quickly. The reviewers got all over their algorithm and tested it. And I don't know, somehow Nature found out we were up to this. And so these two papers ended up getting published on the same day. And lo and behold, Google decided to make their code much more freely available than we were expecting. So this is a great story. We're proud of the part that we played in catalyzing this. And now you all can decide whether AlphaFold or Rosetta Fold is better, and you can pit them against each other, and that's the way it should be. So this is open code doing for good, all right? And this all played out really great. And we made it breakthrough of the year. And I wrote a glowing editorial, which I always write for the breakthrough of the year, saying the protein folding problem was solved. And a whole bunch of biophysical chemists got very mad at me because, of course, they don't see AI structure prediction as solving the protein folding problem. They just see it as a way to get the structure. So I'll let you debate that with them as well. But I love it if you argue with them and end up generating some great papers that I can publish. Very similar to that, we started getting papers on RNA structure prediction. There's a lot of commercial activity in this space. I have to have a disclaimer because I'm actually a partner of a venture capital firm that owns part of Ribometrics, but Ribometrics has got a lot of great competitors. And RNA targeting by small molecules is super hot in the biotech space right now. And using these same principles to get RNA structure may get us more drugs than on the protein side, who knows? But that's exciting too. All right, so that's the protein folding story. Now let's go to another even hotter topic, which is where COVID comes from. And I'll just kind of take you through the timeline of how things have evolved. So, and we've played a very important role in this throughout the time that this has been going. I'm making sure I've got plenty of time before Brian yells at me. So So in the early days of COVID, there wasn't a whole lot of discussion about where COVID came from. There were some people saying, oh, the Chinese must have engineered this, or it was engineered in Chapel Hill, but there was a lot of people thought it came from the wet market in Wuhan. And not a lot of discussion. Well, then, there's pressure from politicians, and eventually the WHO sends a team to Wuhan to look at this, and they wrote a report that said that it almost certainly came from an animal. We call that zoonosis, and that it was highly unlikely that it originated in a laboratory, which turned out to be correct. But a lot of people felt, and I agree, that if we were going to defend that conclusion to all the conspiracy theorists and politicians who were trying to tell us that was wrong, that we needed to do a better job of ruling out the lab leak hypothesis more rigorously. So we published a letter, which a lot of people objected to. But like I said, when we get in trouble, that's my decision. So it was ultimately my decision to publish the letter from Jesse Bloom, who's in the upper right-hand corner of that picture, who's a virologist at Stanford, probably the most prominent virologist who still thinks that the lab leak theory is viable, and 14 or 15 other scientists who all felt that there should be a more rigorous investigation of the lab leak. Now, a lot of those people who signed it were not necessarily, and me in terms of deciding to publish it, were not necessarily people who thought that the lab leak was more likely or even somewhat likely, but who felt that the lab leak should be more rigorously ruled out if we could, so that we didn't have this lingering debate about all this. But a lot of people criticized us as saying that by publishing that letter, we were fueling the conspiracy theorists. So looking back on it, we're pretty happy we published the letter, because a lot of the authors who were on there did start digging into this and came much, much further to the conclusion that zoonosis is so much more likely as that the lab leak is almost completely ruled out. And one of those is Mike Warraby, who's in the middle on the top of that, who's professor at Arizona, and I'm going to describe his paper to you. So Mike signed the letter saying we needed more investigation, and then went and did the investigation. In the lower right is Alina Chan, who's one of the strongest proponents of the lab leak. In my opinion, mostly on behavioral evidence, not scientific evidence. And then that's Lin-Fa Wang, who's a hardcore zoonosis guy. And in the upper left is John Cohen, who is our journalist who covers all of this. And if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend the HBO documentary, How to Survive a Pandemic, which is all about John Cohen going and finding out a lot of this stuff. And he's a great and entertaining journalist in every respect. And he hosted this debate that we had about this. Then we started publishing papers about this, some mostly perspectives at the beginning before there were data. Eventually, we published this perspective from Mike Warraby himself. This is a map of the early cases of COVID. And you can see here are the two labs. Here's the market, and the cases are mostly around the market. You can just tell that with your eyes. There are a few cases down by the lab, but not nearly as many as there are up here. So this was kind of the first stake in the ground here. But eventually, Mike's group did a much more rigorous study of all this, which we published about, 8 weeks ago. And these papers, so here's the first open access part of this. These papers were all in preprints, all right? Everybody here knows what preprints are, I'm sure. Science is very much in favor of preprints because we like it when the experts can go ahead and start talking about their data. And we don't think it takes anything away from us when we publish the paper, because If something's a preprint, even if it gets covered in the news, when we publish it, it's way bigger because we have all these teams that make sure that our papers are heavily covered, and that was certainly the case with these. So these were in preprints. They were controversial, and the lab leak crowd was all over social media, taking them apart. But we had them reviewed. We studied them very, very carefully because we knew they're going to be read on the floor of Congress. And whenever that happens, it's all hands on deck. So this figure from the paper, these are the cases that the World Health Organization has in their data from December of 2019. And the orange cases are ones where there was a known link to the market. And the blue cases are ones where there was not a known link to the market. And as you can see, just with your eye, they're pretty well aggregated around the market, even the ones that don't have a known link. And of course, the other open part of this is that these data were on the internet, and Morabee was able to get them to analyze them. And here's, these are pretty simple calculations to do, but if you calculate the epicenter of all these cases centered in the market, if you take the linked cases out, you still get a pattern that's aggregated around the market. And if you then take even more data, everything, not just the WHO data, but data from lots of sources, those also center on the market, and these are the centers of all of those. And over here, that's the center of the Wuhan population. So if it was totally random, you'd expect it to be over here. And all these different subsets are all of these points over here. And what's really important about this, which I'll say more about in a second, is that there's another paper that the same group published showing that there are two distinct genetic lineages of these early cases. And both of those lineages are also centered on the market, okay? This is a great kind of open data thing. These are check-ins of different sites on social media in Wuhan, right? So these are supermarkets, shopping malls. This is how many people, it's a big city. These are how many people checked into the biggest one. You see buildings, hospitals, schools, markets. All the way down here is the Hunan market. So the Hunan market is not the center because there are a lot of people going there compared to other sites where the virus could have spread more easily. And then here's a figure that shows a map of the market itself. This is where the animals are kept, and all these little squares are where there are human cases. So almost all of them on the same side of the market where the animals are. There are a few over here on the other side. So all of this pointing pretty strongly to the market being the epicenter, and that the animals are the source of the virus. And it's hard for us to understand, but there are millions and millions of live animals being traded in these environments. And so the flow of animals through the wildlife trade in China is just absolutely enormous. And that's a very conspicuous fact in this. And the other thing that's important is that this is how we got SARS-1. So even if you were to discount all this, you'd have to say that there's some reason why we got SARS-1 from zoonosis, where we actually found the animal that started it, and somehow SARS-2 didn't form that way. Okay, so like I said, the same group had a paper that we published together on the molecular epidemiology of this. There are two distinct lineages. And the first was introduced around November 18th, 2019, and the second was probably a couple of weeks later, right? So now, go back to the map and ask yourself how you could get this map given these facts. Well, you'd have to have somebody at the lab who got infected by an animal or ridiculously by an engineered virus that they made, or I don't know. I don't get how that part works. But let's say they had an animal that they took to the lab that had COVID, they got infected. They'd have to go to the market, infect an animal or a human, and go back to the lab and not infect anybody else. And 2 weeks later, somebody with a different strain would have to go to the market, infect another animal, and go back and not infect anyone. Okay, so does that rigorously rule out? Is it completely ruled out, the lab leak? Well, no, because we're all scientists and we know we don't ever completely, no rate constants are zero. and every finding is subject to more investigation. Do I think it's likely that we'll get a paper about the lab leak that we'll want to review that will blow this up? I think it's extremely unlikely. Would we review it if it was credible? You better believe it. You think this is big. Just imagine if we got the paper that proved that the lab leak was right. But of course, I think it'd have to be very rigorously reviewed. And I think it's very unlikely that that's going to happen. So, a lot of the people who shoot at this say, well, this is all groupthink because the scientists want to make themselves look good and don't want to make it look like they're sloppy in the lab or whatever. I would definitely review the paper if I got a credible paper about the lab leak. I promise you. So that's what's great about science. The fact that we love proving each other wrong is a major protection device that we have that the public doesn't appreciate. All right, so now the thing about these papers being in preprints is, of course, all the lab leak folks read the preprints very, very carefully. And when we published them, they were toned down compared to what the authors sent us. This is what happens with every paper. We tone down every paper. We don't allow the word first. We don't allow the word breakthrough. We don't allow the word novel. We don't allow the word, we don't let people hype papers because if they're in science, they're already hyped. They don't need to be hyped anymore. Am I going on Star Tours? Yeah, okay. All right. So sorry, I live in Orlando. I hear that. That's the Star Tours sound. So we don't need to hype papers. So we tone them all down. And the conspiracy theorists got they had the word dispositive in there. Okay, we said, okay, guys, dispositive is a little over the top. Because of course, we wouldn't want to tell anybody because the first thing's going to happen. Eventually, there'll be a hearing in Congress. Mike Warby will have to go there. Rand Paul will say, is there a chance that have you completely ruled out the lab leak? And he'll have to say, well, no, because you could have this sequence of very improbable events that we can't completely rule out. So and then Rand Paul would say, oh, well, you said it was dispositive. We didn't want that to happen. So we changed things we changed it to stuff like strongly suggests, okay, and highly supportive of zoonosis and stuff like that. And the conspiracy theorists think that the reviewers made us do that because they weren't persuaded by the data. They weren't. I and Caroline Ash and Val DeVinson, who worked with me on these papers, we're the ones that made those changes. And we know these papers were going to be highly scrutinized. We went through every single word of them. And it wasn't because the reviewers weren't convinced. So that's another open access part because the preprints allowed the comparison with the published version. And the open data part is that all these data were accessible. And the political part is that a lot of people said that, well, and this gets to a lot of stuff Brian was talking about anti-Asian bias in America, that the people who are the liberals who are pushing the zoonosis are doing what the Chinese government wants. Well, we, at least as far as science is concerned, we love Chinese scientists. We don't necessarily love the Chinese government any more than we love the American government. And the Chinese government is pushing the theory that is just as improbable, if not more, that somehow the virus was transported into China and then and it didn't come from an animal that was raised in China. And we have a big news story about that John Cohen wrote called Anywhere But Here. That's the Chinese government's slogan about this, which I think is just as wrong. So the conspiracy theorists who say that we're pushing the zoonosis because we want more Chinese papers in our journal, or because we're we're too whatever they think we are, cooperative. The Chinese government, George Gao, who's the head of the Chinese CDC, is cranky with us that we publish these papers just as much as Rand Paul is. So, the science has to ultimately be the thing, not the political part. But it's certainly not true that that this is some kind of scheme to reward the Chinese government by sorting this out. And I wrote a very tough piece at the beginning of all this about the failure of China to disclose more information about the pandemic early on. Okay, one last thing, example. Looks like I'm going to be perfect because this one's short. About open data. So these big companies have a lot of amazing data. I mean, you could tell that from Aaron's talk just now. And I'm sure Dan has got some nice stuff on his servers that the world would like to see, and that could drive a lot of great science. Yes, but the Nordstrom and Strata want to charge people to look at those data. And there's a lot of this coming now in social science, because Facebook and LinkedIn are sitting on the greatest treasures in the history of social science data. And the scientific world could do two things about this. We could say, we're not going to publish all of that because it came from proprietary sources, or we could try to partner with them to come up with ways to use their data to do important things in science. And so we've started venturing into this. So this is our first foray, which was just from last week. There's a big theory in social science called the strength of weak ties. And for all the grad students who are going to be looking for jobs, what this says is, if you met me today and you friended me on LinkedIn, and then you asked me to connect you to somebody to help you get a job, that's more likely to work than it is for somebody you've known your whole life. That weak ties are actually more useful than strong ties. And there are lots of ways this plays out in social science. This theory's been around for a long time, tested many times, but there's no better way to test it than with the data that LinkedIn has. Because everybody's on LinkedIn because they want to get a job. So it's very easy to measure the success. And LinkedIn has incredible data on the strength of the connections that people have to each other. So LinkedIn made a bunch of these data available to some outstanding social scientists. They sent us a paper, we reviewed it. We worried a lot about the terms, so you can see what we agreed to here. All original analysis code, aggregated data, and annotated code sufficient to replicate all correlation regressions are available here. We know this, we know this link works. Individual level data supporting this study are not public available due to user privacy and other legal restrictions. Researchers seeking replication should submit a request to LinkedIn, and they get to decide whether they give you the data or not. All right, is that perfect? No. Would I've preferred it if LinkedIn just said, here's all the data that we pulled this from? Sure. They weren't going to do that. So we had to make a decision whether to agree to this or not, and whether to publish this paper. We got a bunch more of these in the pipeline, and they're all blockbuster papers. This paper was all over the news, and we think this is maybe not even the most significant one that we've seen, but still proud to publish it, and it was great, excellent science paper, and big deal in social science. We're getting some serious snark about this. Some of it we deserve. The New York Times wrote a tough piece. If you're in the data science world, as you all are, I actually encourage you to go read this, even though they said some things about me, not me personally, but about our journal that I didn't love. But they framed the problem here. So guess what? This study came out great for LinkedIn. Okay, because it shows that that LinkedIn is a great way to find a job, because that's how you can get the most weak ties. All right. So how do we know that? So if the data hadn't shown that, would LinkedIn have given it to us? Probably not. Yeah. Not probably not. They wouldn't have. And of course, then there's another thing, which is this experiment was done on millions of people who didn't know that this experiment was being done. Now, when you create your LinkedIn account, you click on something that says, I agree, that you didn't read. That gives them the ability to do this. So, that's bringing awareness to that is good, I guess. And so you can see some researchers who are kind of activists in this space. And this is a guy we love, Dietrich Scheffley, who works in this space, but he was not happy with us for doing all this stuff. And, I see where he's coming from. But I didn't have the option. So, he's saying we should have just not published this. Well, it's a very important theory in social science. We vetted all the terms with really experienced social science researchers. They agreed we should go ahead with it. We peer reviewed the peer review, in a sense, when we did that. And, it's a high impact paper. So we decided to publish it. Now, I'm glad we saw all this, because we've got a bunch more in the pipeline. And, watching how this played out helped us think about how we could do this better in the future and what we might get out of it, or how we might, lower some of these concerns. But these are the questions we're all going to be wrestling with, because if LinkedIn's not showing their data, let's say Dan decides he's going to let you write a paper about his stuff, and it's awesome and proves a big thing about cancer, and we want to publish it. How are we going to go about deciding whether that's, we've adequately controlled for all this stuff? That's a work in progress. And so I think the point of this whole talk, when it comes to open access, open code, and open data, is, as I said, the devil's in the details. It sounds good to have all this stuff open, but you all, as you go forward in your careers, are going to be spending, and even right now, are going to be spending a lot of time peeling this onion, because every time you think you've figured out every way to make the code available, there's another thing that comes along. Or, I have a really cool job in so many ways. And, sometimes I have to decide things like, well, we got this rock out of the bottom of the middle of the ocean, and here's what we concluded from it about the evolution of the Earth. But we can't make this rock available to everybody. So what do we do about that? Or, we got these fossils and we can't make them available because they came from this indigenous land, and we can't take it from there. So we can't put it in a repository where other scientists can come observe it, because we'd be, appropriating it. And now we got all the same things with data, and the code, and the papers. Who can change it? Who verifies it's right? Who pays to store it? And who decides that enough is enough in terms of what's open and what isn't? So those are the challenges I leave you all with. I'm happy to hear your thoughts about this. This is something that's going to continue to evolve. And I'll skip that since Brian's about to yell at me. And here's the team that brings you Science Magazine every week. Like I said, these are some of the smartest people I've ever worked with, and I've been in a lot of great academic departments and a lot of great schools. But these are brilliant scholars who read papers for a living, and they have an unbelievable ability to determine when they're correct and when we should publish them. And I think of them as my faculty colleagues in every respect. So thank you so much, Gil. It's an honor to be the Omenn lecturer, and congratulations to your department on 10 years of great success.